The task of a leader is to get people from where they are to where they have not been. That's a quote by Henry Kissinger. Leaders, transformational leaders, bring about change. Transformational leadership is all about helping in situations where there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. It's particularly useful when there's a lot of complexity. Corporations need transformational leaders. During the last 50 years, there's been a decline in Fortune 500 companies and how long they have been able to exist. The decline has been from 75 years to 15 years. What a shame! It does not have to be that way. It is possible for a company to renew itself and refresh its competitive position so it can continue to be competitive. One example of this is 3M. 3M is hardly recognizable now from how it got started as the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company. In fact, 35% of 3M's revenue comes from products that are under 5 years old. So it is possible to have this kind of continual renewal. Today I'm going to talk about some research all about transformational leadership. Plus, I'm going to give you 2 actual examples that will illustrate it in action. This was some very special research. What this research discovered was 3 managerial behaviors that managers can take to help with transformational leadership. And they are enabling, sense-making, and facilitating shared leadership. Enabling is all about balancing the forces of order and disorder, order and chaos. If you're a manager, what you want to do is, well, you don't want to impose too mechanistic of a structure on your team. At the same time, you also do not want to have the situation be so laissez-faire and organic that people don't know what to do. You have to find that middle ground. Some structure can help. A great example of using some structure is a cross-functional team. It has elements of order. It also has some elements of chaos. This is where the manager fosters creativity and experimentation and exploration, yet with a purpose. What is sense-making all about? Sense-making is really needed whenever there's a situation where the environment has shifted. Sometimes what can happen is that the facts in the environment can appear to be nonsensical. So you need a manager to step in and try to make some sense of it. An example of a company that found itself facing a lot of nonsensical facts is Kodak. Kodak defined itself as being all about chemical film and photographic equipment. Then with the advent of digital media, the company started to flounder and was not thriving anymore, which I think is really a shame. If they had viewed themselves as being about media and media products for consumers, there would have been numerous opportunities for them to continue to grow and thrive and prosper. Sense-making, what a manager can do is pattern the attention of people on a team. Bring their attention to certain key areas. Help that team to pursue a vision or to move towards clarifying a vision. Then there's facilitating shared leadership. This is important for a manager to do when all of the knowledge isn't not present in one person. In other words, you have to have a team to be the leader. The role has to be shared. What a manager can do then is help that team to interact, help facilitate the flow of knowledge, and help to integrate knowledge together. There's some very specific things a manager can do. There's external intervention. One thing that a manager can do is help that team to manage time. Another thing they can do is have exercises, for instance, to help the team question each other so they can get a better understanding of where everyone's coming from. It's also possible to manage the internal environment, to make sure that team has a shared purpose, to make sure everyone on that team is supported and everyone's voice is heard. When you're in a situation that requires transformational leadership, this is a situation that's unknown. In the traditional way that management typically works, managers will really specify what employees do and how they do it. But in a situation that requires transformational leadership, it's important to allow an emergent process to happen, to allow for a little bit of chaos, yet also to be able to take certain steps to be able to help that team move forward. Those steps are enabling, sense-making, and facilitating shared leadership. The first example I'm going to give you today happened at DuPont. DuPont was founded in 1802 as an explosives company. They were incorporated in 1899. They were cooking right along, doing really well. Then in 1902, the board met and decided to sell the company. The reason was because many of the top leaders had died. Some of them were sick. They were old. They just could not go on. There was only one remaining DuPont, Alfred I. He said to them, "I want to buy the company. Just give me a week to make the arrangements." Well, they thought he was crazy, but they said, okay. Alfred called up his cousins, Coleman and Pierre, and he said, "I want you to come with me so we can together buy the company." And they did. Once they started working in the company, they realized that DuPont had wealth beyond their imagination. DuPont owned parts of many, many companies. They had many, many investments. Coleman stepped up as the president. He realized that being in the explosives business was very dangerous. Factories blew up a lot of the times. Workers were killed. Sometimes supervisors were killed. Sometimes even family members were killed. He had the idea, the sense-making idea of transforming the company from an explosives company to a chemical manufacturing company, where they could do things a lot more scientifically. Coleman was also an enabler because he found a way to get that to happen. He could realize that not one company that DuPont had, they operated independently, but not one company could afford to have a laboratory and be able to conduct research. It take a lot of money because it take a lot of time to create new products that way. But he realized that together, if they pooled all their resources, they could afford it, and he made it happen. The main contribution that Coleman made to DuPont had to do with facilitating shared leadership. In the first place, he had a philosophy of cooperative action. He believed that the managers at the top could cooperate and work together, and that would be the most effective way to move forward. He believed in the principle of partnership. He believed that rewards and responsibilities should match. In fact, he believed that it was possible for a person to work in DuPont as a leader and be able to earn as much money as if they broke away from DuPont and became entrepreneurs, started up a business on their own. In fact, he created that situation where it did happen. In fact, at a certain point, there was this whole esprit de corps throughout the company. There was a feeling that you could accomplish great things at DuPont. The three major contributions he made in terms of facilitating shared leadership, well, the first one happened in 1903. He was very influential in bringing about the executive committee, which was the governing body of the company. When this committee was formed, it broke precedent, because before this, the only people that were authorized to run the company were DuPont. You had to be a DuPont heir. But after that, it was whoever was actually working to implement the business of the company that was on that committee. In 1905, he introduced two special bonuses. Class A bonuses were for people that came out with new inventions that were fundamental to the progress of the company. Class B bonuses were for people who contributed in a more general way to the success and prosperity of the company. Finally, this last contribution that Coleman made, I felt like was just amazing. It happened at a certain point in time when he got sick and he felt like he was going to have to leave the company. He went to the board at DuPont and tried to sell his stock to the board. He had the idea that he would sell it to them at a reasonable price, and then they would make it available for key people in the company to purchase. He had, in fact, brought in a number of key people between 1902 and 1909. These were people that just graduated from technical school, the cream of the crop. He also had nurtured and brought in as leaders a lot of members of the DuPont family. And he wanted those that had stepped up in a big way to be rewarded accordingly. Alfred opposed him. He did not want Coleman to get a reasonable price for his stock, and he certainly did not want these other individuals, leaders in the company, the younger ones, to have ownership of the company. What happened was that 6 key members of the executive committee broke away from DuPont. They formed a syndicate, they formed a company called Christiana Securities, and they pooled their DuPont stock in that entity. Then they bought the stock from Coleman, and they carried out Coleman's wishes. They actually ended up giving that stock to those key leaders in the company that deserved it. This way, they would be owners in the company, and they would have a self-interest in carrying out the future of DuPont and making it prosperous. Coleman truly was a transformational leader. My second example happened at Burlington Northern. What happened was that this company was a railroad company, and they wanted to go into something called intermodal, which means railroads and trucking combined in order to get the goods to the destination. Before deregulation, if trucking was involved in the railroad business, you'd have to have a whole separate contract. But after that, it was different. Deregulation happened in 1981, and Burlington Northern asked Bill Greenwood to take over this business and make it fly. He was excited about it because he could really see a trend out of boxcars and into flat cars and containers. He thought that's the way the business was going, so he wanted to be a part of it. This was totally against the grain of most of the people that worked at Burlington Northern. They were railroaders. They saw truckers as being second-class upstarts, fly-by-nighters. And it didn't even matter to them that trucking had been taking away a lot of the railroad business for many years. They just were entrenched in this railroad culture, and they did not care about this new area. When Bill Greenwood stepped into this position, he realized he, in and of himself, did not know all the answers. He did not know how to do this. He would have agreed with what Ronald Reagan said. Ronald Reagan said, the greatest leader is not necessarily the one that does the greatest things. It's the leader that gets the people to do the greatest things. 3 other people joined Bill Greenwood as a cross-functional team early on. one of the first things they decided to do was to enroll people in a task force. This task force is the order part of enabling. These 40 people that served on this task force were in various positions, all the different positions throughout the company. They were to study intermodal and come up with recommendations and a strategy for pursuing it, which they did. What they found was that $500 million was going to go out of boxcars. That was 1/10 of Burlington Northern's business. That got people's attention. This is something they have to pay attention to whether they want to or not. Up until now, there had been 160 ramps throughout the country, throughout the U.S., that connected up with truckers. They were not in any organized fashion. So one of the first recommendations going forward that the task force made in terms of strategy was to take those 160 ramps and consolidate them into 22 hubs that would connect up with the interstate highway system. The disorder part of enabling had to do with this cross-functional team. There were 3 other people from the task force that joined this cross-functional team. Bill Greenwood led this team, and they really were the enablers. What they did is they uprooted a lot of the established order in order to make intermodal happen. This was hard to do. Even their bosses were opposed to them and did not think intermodal was the way to go. But they were convinced of it. And I was going to tell you about how Bill facilitated shared leadership. This group of 7 that was on this cross-functional team represented all. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly Bill Greenwood truly, in fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. What happened was Bill did not get a global go-ahead from them. Instead, what they did is that they agreed to pay for 2 tests. Each of them picked a hub, and they picked 2 hubs that they thought would be most likely to fail. When Bill Greenwood heard this, he was not pleased. He went back to his team and told them the news. He was really surprised by their reaction. They were thrilled. They're like, okay, now we get to take some action. We get to do something. So what happened? What happened was that both of these hubs exceeded all expectations. They were dramatically successful. After this, there was no stopping this team. They were on fire. Still, there was a lot of resistance within the organization. They went to the finance department and they asked for an existing cost model. They wanted to come up with a pricing structure. They wouldn't give it to them, so they borrowed it. They wanted to put together a profit and loss statement. the people at Burlington Northern would not let them use their computers. So they went out and bought PCs and did it anyway. The communications department at Burlington Northern would not set it up so that they could communicate with each other and with their hubs. So they went out and got voicemail and just did it anyway. The result of all this is that Burlington Northern became the best railroad company that was in intermodal. In fact, it ended up being a billion-dollar business. Certainly, Bill Greenwood truly was a transformational leader. I think this quote by Leroy Imes sums it up. A leader is one who sees more than others see, who sees farther than others see, and who sees before others see. Transformational leadership is very useful when the situation you're facing is uncertain, when there's a lot of ambiguity. It's especially useful when there's a whole lot of complexity involved in the environment and in your situation. What it means is that as a leader, you need to take a step back and take a broader view of your situation. That's what a transformational leader will do. There's certain actions that a transformational leader can take. Enabling, sense-making, and facilitating shared leadership. Enabling is all about balancing the forces of order and chaos. It's about helping that team to communicate, experiment, and explore, yet with a purpose. A great example is a cross-functional team creating and guiding a cross-functional team. When one example of enabling happened when Coleman helped DuPont to start a laboratory. He realized that not one of their companies could afford it, but all together they could afford it. Enabling at Burlington Northern was a two-step process. The first part was the order part. They formed a 40-person task force of people and functions throughout the company. And they came out with a strategy, a plan going forward. Then there's the disorder part of enabling. And that was the cross-functional team of 7 who were in positions throughout the company that they could and did uproot the existing order in order to get this going and make it happen. In terms of sense-making, Coleman at DuPont he had a vision, and he saw a future that would mean taking DuPont away from inventing new explosives through trial and error, through working in the laboratory to become a chemical manufacturing plant using science based on the fundamentals of chemistry. That was his vision. He definitely brought new sense-making to DuPont. Sense-making at Burlington Northern was really about the cross-functional team, and particularly Bill Greenwood, convincing the 2 top executives to actually invest money going forward to make this happen. Since they were not able to totally dismiss intermodal as complete hokum, they agreed to pay for 2 tests. In this case, it was more about the top 2 guys just acquiescing to the transformational leaders below them. In terms of facilitating shared leadership, Coleman did one thing, I'm just going to give you one example of something he did at DuPont that was really major, and that is that he was influential in helping them form the executive committee. This meant that the top leaders in the company, those that were implementing in the company, were those making the decisions in the company, the governing body. This broke precedent because now it wasn't only DuPont heirs that were doing that. In terms of facilitating shared leadership at Burlington Northern, Bill Greenwood was able to get his cross-functional team to come together And because they were in positions throughout the company where they could actually implement this, they did. Both Greenwood and Coleman knew that in and of themselves they did not have the knowledge and the ability to implement the great things that they did. Instead, what they did is they put together a powerful team and they allowed the answers to emerge. In both cases it worked and they were successful. Transformational leadership. In transformational leadership, there's 3 managerial behaviors that you can use: enabling, sense-making, and facilitating shared leadership. Transformational leadership allows you and your team to get to places you have not been to before.